Hi everyone, today I am comparing two popular arcade buttons from Qanba. On the left side we have buttons from the new KT series, and on the right side we have the ever popular KS buttons. This is a side-by-side teardown looking at individual button components, their function, materials used, and how they fit together. In this video, I will be pointing out the differences, but also a few similarities between the KT and the KS buttons. From the outside, these buttons look very similar. The most noticeable difference between them is the color of the bottom sound dampening silicone insert and the shape of the openings on either side of the housing which guide the button plunger. Although the color variations between the KT and the KS buttons is minimal, there are some subtle differences in the materials and texture. Their overall shape and size are identical, which means that the KT and the KS buttons are interchangeable and will fit exactly the same when installed in your arcade controller. Let's have a closer look and compare each individual component of these buttons. The overall plunger shape and size is virtually identical, with some minor differences between the KT and the KS variants. Both parts are made from the exact same plastic and share the same glass-like texture and transparency. The two silicone inserts are very different. The KT plunger silicone pad has a circular groove in the middle and large cutouts on either side to allow the retention plate to spin without any friction when the button plunger height is adjusted. These two pads are made out of the same material, have the same thickness and the outer diameter, but their alignment nibs are in different spots. One of the most significant differences between the KT and the KS buttons is between their silicone retention plates. The KS plate is made out of one solid piece of semi-transparent plastic, while the KT plate is composed from two separate pieces, which allows the four prongs to rotate. To demonstrate how these parts fit together, let's assemble the KT button plunger. The artwork inserts I am using are 20.5 mm in diameter and will fit both the KT and the KS buttons. When inserting the silicone pad, it is important to properly position its alignment nibs inside the plastic cap. To install the retention plate, position it in place, then with uniform pressure, clip in the other side. The four prongs should be rotating freely. And now let's see how the KS button plunger fits together. The silicone pad from the KS button has four alignment nibs that slide into slots on either side of the plunger tabs. There are no moving parts on the KS retention plate, which pops into place easily with just a bit of pressure. Now let's have a look at the switches. The KT and the KS buttons all use the same Omron gray mechanical switches. They are linear silent and are rated for a 70 million cycles lifespan. These switches are identical in every way. The blue KT and the black KS silicone sound dampeners are made of very similar materials with almost identical elastic properties. They are the same thickness and have almost the same footprint, but the KT silicone dampener uses a bit less material. The most significant difference is that the KT dampener has only one positioning and support groove in each corner, while the KS dampener has two. Inside the KT button housing, the supports that keep the silicone insert in place are different heights. One is long and the other one is short. And when we look inside the KS button housing, both silicone supports are full height. This is what makes the KS silicone flex less and feel firmer than the KT silicone, although both are made from the same material. When properly seated inside the button housing, the grooves in the silicone need to align perfectly with the plastic supports. Let's assemble the bottom part of the button, then see how everything fits together. The switch is held in place by two very strong clips on the button housing, and it needs to be positioned with its two solid sides facing toward the clips. Firm pressure is needed to snap in the switch properly. With the KT button housing, installing the switch works exactly the same. When placing the KT silicone sound dampener, the two cutouts fit over the switch clips and the four grooves slide over the plastic supports. The KS sound dampener also has two cutouts that fit over the switch clips, but instead of one groove, the KS silicone has two grooves in each corner that match up with two supports on all sides. Installing the KT plunger requires a bit of precision. To ensure the prongs from the retention plate match up perfectly with the four slots on top of the switch, the prongs need to be rotated so they are centered. This is the easiest way to align the slots on the switch with the prongs before the plunger is clipped in. Installing the KS plunger is a bit more straightforward. Because there are no rotating parts, the prongs on the retention clip are already aligned with the slots on the switch. All we need to do is clip it in. Let's have a look at the button heights. In its middle position, the KT button plunger is 3 mm above the rim, which is half a millimeter lower than the KS button. When set to the maximum height, the KT plunger is 3.5 mm above the rim, same as the KS button. And when set to the lowest height, the KT plunger is 2.5 mm above the button rim, which is a whole millimeter lower than the KS button. Before I reassemble the rest of these buttons, let's take a closer look at the colors and material textures. These are the blue buttons. The bottom of the KS housing has a slight texture, and when we look at the top rim, the KT button appears frosted while the KS button is clear. The blue KT and the blue KS button plunger colors appear identical. Both are equally transparent and have a glass-like finish. Here we have the green buttons. The only noticeable difference between them is the textured top rim on the KT button, which also has 3 button height indicators engraved into it. Apart from that, the colors are identical. And these are the red buttons. As you can see, the plastic used for the KT and the KS buttons is almost identical, with some very small differences. Once installed into your arcade controller, the only way to visually identify the KT and the KS buttons will be by their top rim, while the plungers will be almost indistinguishable. Because there are so many similarities between the KT and the KS buttons, certain components could be swapped between them. For example, the bottom sound dampening silicone pad from a KT button will fit into a KS button and vice versa. Let's have a look if swapping components will have any effect on button functionality. When swapping silicone inserts, they will fit around the arm-mount module perfectly, since both the KT and the KS buttons use identical switches. To test the silicone pad swap, each button will receive its own plunger assembly. With the KS silicone insert, the KT button will function perfectly fine in its default middle position. But because the KS insert has an additional support channel in each corner, the KT button plunger will no longer be height adjustable. That bit of additional silicone gets in the way. The KS button using the KT silicone insert will function without any issues. Next, I will leave the bottom half of each button unmodified and will swap the entire plunger assembly between the KT and the KS buttons. Because the KS plunger assembly has a fixed retention plate, when installed into the KT housing, the button will stay in its default middle position. Although it will not be adjustable, this button will function perfectly fine. When swapping the KT plunger into the KS housing, it's important to rotate the retention plate prongs to their center position so they are perfectly aligned with the 4 slots on the arm-mount switch. This combination will function just fine as a standard button, but because of the rotating prongs on the retention plate, the plunger will be free to spin from side to side a bit more. This is obvious when compared to the standard KS button, but it will not affect the normal button functionality. When swapping plunger assemblies between the KT and the KS buttons, both variations produce a perfectly functioning standard button that has no height adjustments. Now let's assemble the red KT and KS buttons so we can compare the overall button plunger heights and their travel distance. With the KT adjustable plunger height, there are going to be obvious differences when comparing its total travel against the standard KS button. But there is one more significant difference between these buttons which some people may not realize it exists. When we look at these buttons side by side, it becomes apparent that the KT plunger travels farther into the button housing than the KS plunger. After being fully depressed, the KT plunger is only 1 mm above the button rim, while the KS button protrudes 1.5 mm. The KS button plunger travels a total of 2 mm from a starting position at 3.5 mm above the button rim. In its default position, the KT button also travels 2 mm, but its starting position is 3 mm above the rim. When the KT button is adjusted to its highest setting at 3.5 mm above the rim, the plunger travels 2.5 mm. Because of the additional height, the plunger travels farther, but it still remains 1 mm above the rim when pressed. And on its lowest setting at 2.5 mm, the KT plunger travels 1.5 mm. The additional height of the KS button plunger when fully depressed is noticeable and can be felt during gameplay. Although the difference is only half a millimeter, the tactile sensation produced by the KT and the KS buttons is completely different. And the final thing I want to mention is the difference between the KT and the KS button color naming convention. Here I have the KT Clear Light Green button. When compared to the KS Clear Green and the KT Clear Dark Green buttons, it's obvious that the KT Light Green color is significantly different than the KT Dark Green and the KS Green. The KT Dark Green and the KS Green are a close match. The other, more confusing color naming is between the orange buttons. This is the KT Clear Orange button. When compared to the KS Clear Orange, it's obvious that the KS color is more yellow than orange. And if you compare these to the KT Clear Yellow button, you will realize that the KS Orange matches perfectly with the KT Yellow color. Technically, the Qanba KS series doesn't have a yellow button. I hope you found this video informative. Thanks for watching.